My name is Rebecca Halloran, and I'm 46 years old. On a Tuesday in October, I came home from a 9-hour shift at the hospital, put my key in the front door of the house I'd lived in for 11 years, and the key didn't turn. It didn't stick or jam, it simply didn't fit. The lock was new, brass bright against the weathered green door, and taped to the glass was a note in my brother's handwriting that said, "Beck, we need to talk. Call me. Danny." I stood on the porch in my scrubs, with a bag of groceries cutting into my fingers, and I read that note 4 times. We need to talk. As if the conversation could happen through a door he'd locked me out of, as if the polite thing was for me to knock on my own home and wait. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. I called him and it went to voicemail. I called again. I walked around to the back and that lock was new too. Through the kitchen window I could see my coffee mug still on the counter where I'd left it that morning, and that ordinary sight, my mug, my counter, was the thing that made my hands start to shake. Here's what I couldn't understand standing there. This was our mother's house. She'd left it, and I was the one who'd lived in it, cared for it, paid the taxes on it for the 2 years since she died. Danny lived 90 minutes away in a nicer town with a nicer life. What could possibly give my brother the right to change the locks on the house where I slept? I need to ask you something, because the answer wasn't as simple as I wanted it to be. If a house is legally shared between 2 people, and both their names are on it, does either one of them have the right to lock the other out? I thought I knew. I was wrong about almost everything that word ours actually meant. Let me go back, because you can't understand this Tuesday without the 2 years behind it. Our mother, Eileen, died the spring I turned 44. She'd been sick for a long time, and I'd moved back into the house during her last years to take care of her. That's how I came to be living there. Danny came on holidays, made things bright for a weekend, and left. I did the mornings and the medications and the long nights. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it shaped how I saw the house. I felt like I'd earned it. That feeling turned out to be one of my biggest mistakes, though not for the reason you'd think. When Mom's estate was settled, her will left the house to Danny and me equally, 50-50. I remember the lawyer's office, the beige carpet, Danny in a good jacket, me still smelling faintly of the hospital. The lawyer said the house passed to us as co-owners, and that we'd have to decide together what to do with it, keep it, sell it, one of us buy the other out. Danny said warmly, "There's no rush, Beck. You live there. Take your time." And I believed that meant the matter was closed. It wasn't closed. It was postponed. I kept living there. I paid the property taxes out of my own account because I was the one there and it felt fair. I paid for a new water heater when the old one died. I repainted the porch. In my head, every dollar and every weekend was quietly building my claim to the place. I never once sat down with Danny and put any of it in writing, because writing it down would have meant admitting we were on opposite sides, and I wasn't ready to believe that about my brother. There were signs. Of course there were. The first was maybe 8 months after Mom died. Danny called and mentioned, lightly, that his wife Priya had been looking at houses in a good school district for their kids, and that money was tight in a way people don't realize. I said something sympathetic. I didn't hear it for what it was, the sound of a man doing math that included my home. The second sign was sharper. Last spring, Danny drove up unannounced with a real estate agent. I came out onto the porch, and there was Danny, and a woman in a blazer taking pictures of the roofline. He said they were just getting a sense of the market, no pressure. The agent smiled at me like I was a tenant. I told Danny I wasn't ready to sell, and he put his hands up and said, "Nobody's selling anything, Beck, relax." But the agent had already seen the inside of my life through the windows. I told myself he was stressed. I told myself family works these things out. That instinct to keep the peace by refusing to see the fight is the thing I have to own before I tell you the rest. I wasn't only a victim here, I was also someone who chose not to know. So when I stood on that porch in October with a key that didn't fit, part of me had known this was coming and had refused, for 2 years, to prepare for it. I finally reached Danny that night. I'd gone to a motel off the highway because I had nowhere else close, and I sat on a stiff bedspread and called him, and this time he answered. "Beck," he said, and his voice was careful, rehearsed. "I'm sorry about the note. I didn't want it to happen like this. You locked me out of my house." "It's our house," he said. "That's the whole problem. It's half mine, and I can't keep waiting while you treat it like it's all yours. Priya and I are stretched to the breaking point. We need to sell, and every time I bring it up, you shut it down. I felt like I didn't have a choice." I told him that changing the locks was insane, that I had clothes in there, my whole life in there. He said, and this is the part that stayed with me, "You can get your things. I'll be there. I just needed you to finally take this seriously. You weren't listening any other way." He said it like locking your sister out was a communication strategy, like it was something he'd been forced into by my stubbornness. That was Danny's whole method, I'd come to understand. He never did anything wrong. He only ever responded to what other people made him do. I didn't scream. Something in me had gone quiet and clear. I said, "I'll talk to you when I've talked to a lawyer." And I hung up before he could turn it around again. The next morning, I called a lawyer named Frances Okafor, whose name I got from a nurse at work whose divorce she'd handled. Frances saw me on short notice, and I want to tell you exactly what she said, because it was not what I wanted to hear, and it changed everything. I laid it all out of the equal ownership, the locks, the note. I expected her to be outraged on my behalf. Instead, she leaned back and said, "Okay, first the hard part. When two people own a house together like this, as co-owners with equal rights, both of them have the legal right to occupy the whole property. Neither one gets to exclude the other. What your brother did by locking you out, that's very likely improper. You have a real grievance there." "Good," I said. "But," she said, and lifted a finger, "here's the part you won't like. That same rule cuts both ways. He also has the right to be there. And more importantly, he has the right to force a sale of the property whether you agree or not. There's a legal process for exactly this situation when co-owners can't agree. Either one can ask a court to divide or sell the property and split the proceeds. It's not a punishment. It's a remedy. Courts grant it all the time. If your brother files for that, he will very likely win it because you can't force someone to stay a co-owner forever." I sat there feeling the floor drop out. In my head, I'd been the wronged party with the airtight case. In reality, my brother had done one clearly wrong thing. The lock's inside a larger situation where the law was mostly on his side. He couldn't lock me out, but he could make me sell. That was my first real setback, and it was a big one. I'd walked in wanting a weapon. Frances handed me a mirror. She wasn't done. She asked me a series of quiet questions. Whose name was on the tax payments? Mine. Did I have records of the repairs I'd paid for? Some, scattered. Had Danny ever contributed to the upkeep? A little early on, then nothing. She nodded slowly and said, "This is where you might actually have leverage. In a forced sale, the court can account for who paid what. If you've been covering taxes, insurance, major repairs, the water heater, the roof, whatever, you may be entitled to be credited for those from the proceeds before the split. It doesn't stop the sale, but it can change the numbers. And the numbers are really what this is about for him." Then she said the thing that reframed the whole fight. "Rebecca, you keep talking about this like it's about whether you get to keep the house. I don't think you're going to keep the house. I think you should decide right now whether this is a battle over the building or a battle over being treated fairly inside your own family. Because those are two very different cases, and the second one, you can actually win." I drove home to the motel turning that over. I'd wanted the house so badly, or thought I had, that I'd never separated the walls from the wound. The walls I might lose. The wound was something else. The wound was being the one who did the caregiving, the paying, the staying, and then being locked out with a note like a stranger. That night, I made a decision that surprised me. I stopped fighting to keep the house. I started fighting to be seen. But before I could put any of that into motion, the situation turned in a direction I hadn't expected. And this is where the second half of the title comes in, because 2 days later, the sheriff arrived. I'd gone back to the house on the Saturday, as Danny and I had loosely arranged, to collect some of my belongings. He was supposed to meet me there. I got there first. And because I still had the garage remote in my car, and the interior garage door hadn't been rekeyed, I let myself in through the garage. I want to be honest about this. I knew I probably shouldn't have. Francis had told me to be careful and to coordinate everything. But it was my home, my things were inside, and something stubborn in me refused to wait on the porch of my own life again. So I went in. I was in the bedroom, filling a suitcase, when I heard tires on the gravel, and then a knock. A firm, official knock. 3 raps. I opened the front door, and there was a sheriff's deputy, and behind him, at the edge of the driveway, was Danny, standing next to Priya, his arms crossed. My stomach dropped. In that first second, I thought Danny had called the police to have me removed. I thought he'd found a way to make me a trespasser in my mother's house. The deputy was calm and professional. He asked my name. He asked whether I lived there. And here is where the thing Francis had told me became the most important knowledge of my life. I said clearly, yes, I live here. This is my primary residence. My name is on the deed as a co-owner, and I have documentation. I've lived here for 11 years, and I've been paying the property taxes since my mother died 2 years ago. I can show you tax records and mail addressed to me here. The deputy's whole posture shifted. He glanced back at Danny. Because what Danny had done, I later pieced together, was tell the sheriff's office that his sister was unlawfully occupying the property and needed to be removed. He'd framed it as if I were an intruder or a holdover tenant. But a deputy cannot simply throw a legal co-owner out of her own residence on one party's say-so. That's not what law enforcement is for, and this deputy knew it. He stepped away and spoke with Danny for a few minutes. I couldn't hear all of it, but I heard the deputy's voice go flat and instructive, the way you talk to someone whose story has just fallen apart. When he came back, he said to me, evenly, "Ma'am, this is a civil matter. You're a co-owner and this is your residence, so I have no authority to remove you, and I'm not going to. If the two of you can't agree on the property, that's something for a court to sort out, not us. I'd strongly suggest you both get lawyers and stop trying to solve it with locks and phone calls to my office." Then he said something to Danny that I'll never forget, loud enough that I heard it clearly across the driveway. "Sir, changing the locks on a co-owner and then calling us to remove her, that's not how this works. You could be creating problems for yourself. Let it go to court." Danny's face did something I'd never seen it do. The confidence drained out of it. He'd built his whole approach on the belief that if he acted decisively enough, everyone else would simply fall in line: the locks, the agent, the sheriff. He'd assumed authority would back him because he was the one who sounded certain. And here was authority, in a uniform, telling him no. The deputy left. Danny didn't leave right away. He came halfway up the driveway and stood there. And for a moment the old brother was in his face, the one who used to walk me to the bus stop. "I wasn't trying to have you arrested," he said. "I just wanted it resolved. Priya's dad is sick, Beck. We need the money for his care. I didn't know how else to make it move." And there it was, the one true thing at the center of his ugly behavior. Priya's father was ill. They genuinely needed money. Danny wasn't a cartoon villain trying to rob his sister for a boat. He was a frightened man who loved his wife and had convinced himself that the fastest, hardest route was the only one, and that my grief-soaked attachment to a house was a luxury the family couldn't afford. That was my midpoint, standing in that driveway. Up to then, I'd cast Danny as pure betrayal and myself as pure victim. But he had a real need, and I had a real failing I'd refused for 2 years to have the honest conversation that might have kept us out of driveways and sheriffs entirely. We'd both chosen the version of events that let us avoid each other. I could have softened right there. Part of me wanted to, but softening had always been my move, and it had gotten me a taped note on a locked door. So I said, gently, but without giving anything away, "I'm sorry about Priya's dad. I mean that. But you don't get to lock me out and call the police on me and then ask me to feel sorry for you. We do this through lawyers now. That's the only way I can trust it'll be fair." He looked at me for a long moment, then got in his car. Priya wouldn't meet my eyes. Over the next weeks, the fight moved into paper, which is where it should have been all along. And here's where I have to be honest about the counterattack, because Danny wasn't done being clever. He filed for the forced sale, exactly as Francis had predicted he could, but he did something else too. He got our Aunt Marie and 2 cousins involved, calling them, telling them a version of the story where I was the unreasonable one clinging to Mom's house out of grief, refusing to help the family in a medical crisis, forcing poor Danny to take drastic steps. Within a week, I was getting texts from relatives. Aunt Marie left me a voicemail that said, "Rebecca, honey, I know you loved that house, but a house isn't worth a family. Danny's under so much pressure. Can't you just let this go?" That was the hardest part of the whole thing, harder than the locks, harder than the sheriff, because it worked a little. It made me doubt myself. It made me wonder if I really was the villain, hoarding a building while a sick man went without care. Danny had turned my grief into evidence against me, and he'd recruited the people whose opinion of me I still, at 46, cared about far too much. For a few days I nearly caved. I nearly called Danny and said, "Fine, sell it, take whatever, just make them stop looking at me like I'm the problem." The peacekeeper in me was screaming that this was the way out. Frances talked me down. She said, "They're pressuring you to give up your credits, the taxes, the repairs, your legal right to a fair accounting, because it's cheaper for him if you fold out of guilt. Don't confuse being agreeable with being fair to yourself. You can consent to the sale and still insist the numbers be honest." So that became my whole strategy, and it's the strategy I want you to remember because it's the opposite of what these stories usually promise. I did not fight to destroy my brother. I did not fight to keep the house. I agreed in writing that the house would be sold. And then I insisted through Frances on a full accounting of everything I'd put into it. I gathered the evidence, and I want to be clear about what it did and didn't prove. I had 2 years of property tax payments from my own bank account that clearly proved I'd paid the taxes. I had the receipt and installation invoice for the water heater and the roof repair. Those proved I'd paid for major maintenance that preserved the value of the house we both owned. What the records did not prove was that Danny had agreed to any of it in advance, or that he'd promised to pay me back. He could argue, and did, that I'd chosen to pay those things because I was the one living there rent-free, enjoying the benefit of the house while he got nothing. That was a fair point, and Frances told me so plainly. A court might offset my repair credits against the reasonable rental value of my having lived there alone for 2 years. That was the genuine risk. My contributions were real, but so was the benefit I'd received by living there without paying rent to my co-owner. The case wasn't clean. It was a negotiation between 2 people who each had a legitimate number. So we went to mediation rather than trench warfare in court, because Frances was honest that a full trial could eat much of whatever I might recover in legal fees, and could take a year we didn't have while Priya's father was ill. In that mediated session, with both lawyers present, we did the unglamorous arithmetic of a family coming apart. My tax payments and documented repairs on one side, the fair rental value of my sole occupancy on the other. Danny's need for a fast sale on one side, my need to not be erased on the other. We reached an agreement, and it was a compromise, not a triumph. The house would be sold. From the proceeds, I would be credited for a substantial portion of the taxes and repairs I'd paid, reduced by an amount reflecting that I'd lived there without paying rent. After that credit came off the top, the remainder would be split evenly, as our mother's will intended. In the end, I walked away with meaningfully more than a flat 50-50 split, though far less than the whole house I'd once believed was mine. Danny got his sale, and the money his family needed. Neither of us got everything. That's what fair actually looks like, it turns out. It looks like both people being a little disappointed. Danny paid a cost too, and it wasn't one any court ordered. When the relatives eventually learned the full story, that he'd changed the locks and called the sheriff on his own sister and tried to have her removed from her home, the sympathy he'd manufactured evaporated. Aunt Marie called me back, mortified, and said, "I didn't know he'd done that. He made it sound so different." Danny didn't lose his job or his house or his marriage. He lost something quieter and for our family more permanent. He lost the benefit of the doubt. People who used to assume the best about him now wait to hear both sides. And I paid my costs. I lost the house. I truly lost it. Strangers live there now, and I drove past once and saw a child's bicycle on the porch where my mug used to sit in the window. I lost the easy closeness with my brother. We speak, but carefully, like 2 people who've seen what the other is capable of under pressure. And I lost the comforting story in which I was simply the good sister who'd been wronged, because part of this was my own long refusal to have a hard, honest conversation, while it still could have been kind. Here's the callback I owe you. That note, taped to the door. Beck, we need to talk, was true, in the end. We did need to talk. We'd needed to talk for 2 years. Plainly. About money and grief, and a house neither of us could hold on to alone. Danny chose to say it with a lock. I'd spent 2 years refusing to say it at all. The tragedy wasn't that we disagreed about the house. It was that neither of us knew how to just tell the truth to the other, until a deputy stood in the driveway and forced it into the open. What changed in me is specific. I used to believe that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the love. I don't believe that anymore. The peace I kept for 2 years didn't save my relationship with my brother. It just delayed the reckoning and made it uglier when it came. Now, when something matters, I say it early, in daylight, before it can curdle into a locked door. I live in a small apartment across town now. There's no history in it, no mother's kitchen, no 11 years in the walls. Some nights that emptiness aches, but when I put my key in that door, it turns, and no one can tape a note to it deciding my life without me. That ordinary click of a lock that actually opens has become the sound of something I didn't have before, which is a home that is only, entirely, uncontestably mine. Let me leave you with the question I still turn over. When someone you love does something cruel out of a real and desperate need, does understanding their reason make it easier to forgive them, or does it just make it harder to know where the line between compassion and self-respect is supposed to go?